just turned on a red light.
Yeah.
But
All right.
that's
So let's dive in. I've got a bunch to cover here. So welcome. It's great for me to be back in Asheville. I actually I spoke at this conference in 2011. I was realizing last night. I was thinking, I've been to a Drupal Camp Asheville before, and it was a lot of fun. I didn't realize it was that long ago, and I was looking back at those slides, and it was a talk on visual hierarchy, actually, in which I had a slide where I did a breakdown of the panels interface at the time in 2011, and the 86 possible user actions within a single admin interface. So that was a fun little trip down memory lane as I was gearing up for this. But I wanted to do what all good designers do and start with a little bit of audience definition. So I'm kind of curious to get a show of hands here. Who in the room calls yourself a designer, or somehow design is like in the title that you're mentioned when somebody says, "What do you do?" Okay.
I need to be.
Few.
Not yet.
Okay. All right. How about developer? Back end, front end, any? Okay. All right. That's good. How about, who raised your hand for both? Anybody do that? The unicorn types? Okay. This is good. And what about other people? You're a strategist, you're a project manager, you're something else, not a designer or a developer. Okay. All right. We have quite a mix here. A small contingent of designers holding down the fort. What about kinds of projects we work on? So I'm curious, continue the show of hands. How many would say you work on large or extra large scale projects, like either a product team that's very large or your clients are enterprise? All right, that's a good one. What about medium? It's not small, but it's not, okay, some overlaps too with people who raise their hands for large and extra large. Double extra medium, somewhere in the middle there. Okay. How about small? You wear a lot of hats. You jump from project to project quickly. Okay, this is good. Small project people are, it's interesting when they come to a design systems talk because, and so I'm not necessarily talented enough to do the choose your own adventure, but I'm going to try to tailor a little bit of what I cover time on based on what I just saw there. So for myself, I am a designer who has some coding skills. I work on large and extra large scale projects large enough to where we have paid professionals that are front-end developers working with me, so I don't do code on the projects that I'm working on for the most part, other than little code pens and ideas. But and yeah, I lead a strategy and design team. And I work at a company called Lullabot. A couple of my colleagues are actually in the room, I saw for a minute. Mike Herschel, Jen. We've actually got a few of us here at the camp, so if we're a friendly bunch, come meet us if you haven't before. We sort of specialize in what we call working with large-scale digital publishers. So we work on projects where they're trying to use Drupal as a framework to build a CMS that needs to empower often multiple and disparate content teams across brands and business units and those kinds of things. Hence the need for design systems. Because of those kinds of projects, a lot of our clients historically have been in media or higher ed or enterprise tech and those kinds of things. So there's sort of a wide variety of the kinds of design systems projects I've worked on in my 9+ years at Lullabot. Sometimes working alongside internal teams at a large product company that already have a design system team in place and have learned things from that. Often being asked to redesign an entire site in a case where they actually need to move to a system. So my experience is varied. At this point, if you've been wondering what does he mean when he says design system, you're probably not alone. I've actually found the more I talk to people who actually do what I do even, there's a lot of diversity in terms of how people describe these. So we're going to try to cover that. So here's kind of what I hope to try to do in this talk, and it'll probably be very high level sectionally, so if you want to dig deeper with me after, I'll be here the rest of the day. You can see we've flown through the first half of this talk because you're already right there. But most of the meat is going to be in the back half, so we're going to get to where we're defining what a design system is, how we prescribe a design system, how do you know when you need one, And then we're trying to talk about sort of at least how do you get started? What do you do with, how do you get the outset of a project if you're doing a design systems project, especially on a large Drupal build? So first off, what is a design system? What do we mean when we say that? I've heard a lot of different things. Some people, I've had clients that say they have a design system and what they show me is functionally a style guide. Other times, people who are essentially doing atomic design or have used that within their process call it a design system. Sometimes people who have built out a pattern library refer to it as their design system. And other people hear design system and they just think it means their project is going to be expensive. Alla Kolmatova wrote a great book. The title of the book is actually Design Systems. I recommend it. She says in that book there isn't a standard definition of design system within the web community, and people use the term in different ways, sometimes interchangeably with style guides and pattern libraries. And I've definitely found that to be true, especially with our client teams. Ours is an industry and a field that's not very old, to be honest. It hasn't had time to mature yet. My father-in-law was an architect for many, many years before he retired, and I used to love to kind of talk shop with him and learn about their processes. And one of the things that always kind of struck me was that it's this storied field that has all these established practices, and many of them based on things like people will die if you don't follow this, and so this means this and this means that. And our field is not like that. Design systems is a sort of an emerging term. Our field's moving super fast, actually, sometimes at what feels like reckless speed. And it seems like every other week or so, some product team somewhere with boatloads of venture capital rolls out their new design system as a product kind of a thing and shares it with the world, and we all drool over it and wish we could make things like that on our projects. So what do I mean when I say design system? I couldn't find a good definition, so I created my own. So this is my definition. I say a design system is a set of principles, constraints, patterns, and documentation that empower disparate teams to create, maintain, and extend a design efficiently and consistently. I realize it's a mouthful, but I think it's sort of definitional to me at least. Principles, constraints, patterns, and documentation, and those all exist to empower disparate teams to keep a design going, basically. So how do we know when we need one? How do we prescribe design systems? Because a lot of projects want it. When do you know you should be creating one? What are the clues? In describing the process for creating Dropbox's design system, Ed Chow talks about the importance of naming your villain. That's what they called it internally as their team, to sort of identify what is it that we're fighting against. I think there are three sort of common villains that I've noticed that most design systems exist to try to defeat. And those are problems of inefficiency, inconsistency, inefficiency, and scale. Those three problem areas. And when you find all three of these problem areas in a project, you really know that you probably need a design system. You need it even if it's only one of these sometimes, but when all three exist, it's really important. And when all three exist, it's also important to sort of figure out which villain is primary. So you can do things as simple as work together with your team and your client or whoever, internal teams, to put them all on Post-it notes and start sort ordering them together to identify and agree upon together, like, if inconsistency is your primary villain and your team has plenty of designers, maybe your system should be more robust in terms of constraints and help templates for designers. If designers are the ones being inconsistent, if scale is your problem and there are far more editors and marketers than designers and developers, then maybe your design system really needs to be integrated into the CMS more and less on the external templates and things like that. The point is to sort of try to design your design system to match the problems, the challenges that you're solving for, and the team and the roles that you're solving them for. And in case you think a lot of the projects that you work on may be too small for some of what I'm talking about, I think it's important to remember that in most of life, and I really think this is universally true in the sense that it is true of the universe, that complex things evolve or emerge from simpler things. So I think a lot of what I describe in this talk hopefully will be really useful even at very simple levels. It's like John Gall's law. If you're familiar with Gall's law, he was a pediatrician turned author who did a lot of writing about why systems fail. and he talks about how complex systems that work always emerge from simpler systems that work. So what I'm going to try to cover is how do we start simple, basically. And I think a lot of it's like sort of map making. Maps are incredibly complex in terms of what's behind them, but if you make a map that's highly detailed and life-size, it ceases to have any use to anyone. It just is the thing. And so a lot of like sort of designing and modeling design systems is finding that way to map the thing. And even if your projects are smaller, you can consider evaluating these things that I mentioned in my definition and figure out like how much of those does my project need. Sometimes there may be one or two of these things that you're like, well, we're not ready to extend out a full design system, but we should go ahead and start working on these parts in this project and lay the groundwork for something that may become a fuller system later. Okay, so we've covered defining and prescribing. Let's talk about designing them. Where do we start? How do we begin to evaluate the kind of system that we need, the problems it needs to solve, the form it should take, those kinds of things. So step one, I find, is to identify your customers. So if you can think of the design system itself as a product, figure out who are the customers for this product. Who are the people that are going to end up using the design system. It's different on different projects for us, but it's often designers, developers, product people, it can be business people, content people, sales people, all kinds of people that are the customers of the product, of the design system as a product. And so figure out who these people are. If there's large teams, identify key people from each one of those areas or something like that, and begin interviewing them. I recommend doing it individually. You can keep these 30 minutes or less. It makes it easier to get it on their schedule and yours. And talk to them. Take the time to hear from them. Ask them about the current problems they have with whatever the site or product is that you're redesigning or replacing with a design system. Listen for problems that they mention that relate to inefficiency, inconsistency, scale. You know, if they talk about the problems being, because, well, we don't have enough devs to put this thing out, or it takes way too long to make these kinds of landing pages. These kinds of things are good things to use as fodder for, we need a design system. When you have to go sell it up the chain sometimes. And don't just ask them about the problems, ask them what's working well. Ask them, like, if we make a new design system for our project, product, whatever, what can't change? What has to stay the same? Conducting these individually, like I mentioned, can be really useful, we found, for eliciting certain things. Like when you get people together as a larger group, sometimes those things don't emerge. It's often fascinating to hear what people will say when other people aren't in the room. So that's one of the reasons I recommend you do this prior to kind of getting all your customers together for any kind of workshopping. And as you're talking with those customers, another simple thing you can begin with is just a design inventory that you can kind of work on your own. So capture all the different kinds of things that are happening within a current site or network of sites or whatever it is you're redesigning. Even when your current site wasn't created as a design system, you can often end up seeing a system emerging as you've been capturing these things. So catalog all the one-off pages, the things that are highly bespoke, the one-off components, catalog all the patterns you see, the reusable templates, these things. We typically just start in something like a spreadsheet, capture at least a screenshot and a URL where you can see this thing in practice. If your site's really enormous, divide it up among a team. Even have your clients work on it with you. Assign one person to capture every example of buttons they can find on the existing site. Another person, every example of sub-navigation that's happening. The presentation form of it, if you have examples where you're seeing tremendous diversity across a particular area, can be really powerful when you bring people together then for workshopping to actually share and say, here's examples of inconsistency run amok and why we really need a design system. Okay, so you've interviewed your customers, you've inventoried your existing site. What else should you do before you sort of get everybody together and start making a design system? So I would say one thing that I've found is taking a first pass yourself as a design team. It doesn't matter if you're a designer, a front-end developer, somebody being willing to take that first pass at, here's what I think we need. Here are the principles that our organization already has that we can borrow, or here's what I've been hearing based on the problems that people talk to me about. here are the constraints that I already see within our brand guides and stuff. Here are the ones that I think we need to develop. Here are the patterns that we found, or here are the things that it seems like we're missing. And this is the documentation that we wish we had, or this is the documentation we have that no one's using, and that kind of stuff. Asking people to begin poking holes in your ideas I found to be incredibly easy, and people love telling designers what's wrong with their ideas. It's like the easiest thing to ask people to do, so it's a wonderful thing for you to just create a straw man early on and say, here's what I think our design system should be like. So let's go through these things one at a time and talk about what I mean. So design principles, this is pretty straightforward. Some organizations will have organizational principles that you can borrow for design principles. Some organizations, you already have design principles in place depending on where you work or what your product is. They can provide sort of a North Star for where things need to go, or at least show you when this design system was created, this was some of the foundational things behind it. So a couple quick examples from a project that we worked on. This is actually true of a lot of organizations. A lot of times, internal organizational concepts end up extending forward into site designs. And so it can leave users really confused. Like we worked with a nonprofit, and their internal organizational structure was how they organized their navigation and website. Nobody could find anything. And so in this project, one of our design principles for the entire system became organized for outsiders. So anytime we were ever doing a design review, we were always mentioning, like, are we organizing for outsiders here? Have we done a good job at that? Another, celebrate the common. We worked on a really large intranet redesign for a big tech brand. Thousands and thousands of employees. We interviewed 50 people across every role within the organization. And one of the things we noticed, they had things like quick links lists that had 50 links in them along as sidebars. Nobody could find anything. We tried to identify across every single role in an organization what was most commonly used, what were everybody coming to the internet needing to do, and the celebrate the common principle kind of pervaded the design process. So those are just a couple examples. You can straw man these as well. If you have some ideas based on the problems you're hearing, make some principles, go into a workshop with the customers, suggest them, see what kind of feedback you get. You may be surprised. Sometimes it's very easy to get people on board with them. Design constraints. These are really straightforward. So constraints are the kinds of things you often find in style guides historically. They're things like, audience definition, how do we constrain who we're saying these things are for, voice and tone, typography, spacing and rhythm, color, imagery, behaviors and motion. Some of these things you'll find you don't even need in your design system, but stating that together with your customer group at the outset is really useful so that everybody's in agreement. A lot of these things we find that some of them already exist within an organization that we're working with, and so it doesn't take much work to just identify, hey, is it cool for us to just use this? This already exists, and we can find out if it's a problem. It's important to have a good understanding of the primary customers for your design system. If you're working to empower a large team of designers to help create new products and things all the time, consistently, that belong within a design system, like I said, you might want to build out better tools and templates to keep designers consistent, not just a document with, here's the rules around type. But if your design system is primarily serving a team, like I said, of content editors, you may take a different approach. So the form of a design system, there's a lot of different varied forms that they take. Those fancy product versions like I showed you, but then a lot of times it's something as simple as a paper doc that links you away to other resources. There are products out there like Zero Height that lets you sort of, as a SaaS product, to just capture everything within. It's pretty handy. So anyway, we've covered design principles and constraints. Let's talk about how to sort of model out the patterns that make up the system. I've seen sort of two distinct approaches, and I think both are leveraged in our process, but let me go over those. So I think the more common approach that I've seen, at least outside of the Drupal world, in just the design world, is what I call mapping backwards from containers. And I don't think it's the best way, and I'll try to explain why here. So in this method, your starting point is often you're looking at your interface inventory, that design inventory, and you're identifying, hey, we've got this lead space kind of a thing happening, we've got intro patterns, we've got hero promos, we've got calls to action, event cards. and you basically start a process of redesigning said patterns. Or you say, these are the patterns that we define, and these are the design system, you work towards that. There are a couple problems with this method. The first is that your starting point is often something that's not serving everyone very well. If people have gotten on board with you starting a project like this, there's probably problems with the site. It's not just design systems problems. This method will often, at best, it helps you identify all the patterns and problems, but at worst, you're repeating existing problems by just simply redesigning the patterns. Another reason I don't recommend working backwards from like an existing interface inventory to model the system itself is that it really won't lead to any simplification. It'll just reveal additional patterns that customers wish they could use while not invalidating the current ones. So you'll end up with this giant list of patterns that you're designing for, and then people are going to keep giving you additional ones that they wish they had. Oops, my slide's stuck there for a second. We came in on a project to help a design system team at this kind of big tech organization, and there was this fascinating meeting. They realized that they built out this giant thing that they internally had been calling their design language for the whole company. They called it the design language. And after this lengthy process with them, at the end of a meeting, they said essentially, like, they suddenly realized that their design language was they had essentially just handed people the Roman alphabet, and said, I hope you can all write the same kinds of things with it. This is what happens from mapping backwards from the patterns, because they had started with a small set of patterns. They kept increasing patterns because of needs from, we need a pattern like this, and they ended up with every possible pattern that you could want. It's not a great thing. So lastly, I've seen more often that working backwards from sort of presentational patterns, the big reason this is wrong or not the best way is that it misses the nature of the underlying content that patterns exist to display. So I think the better way that I like to try to recommend to people is modeling from content outward. So I'll describe that. One of the things that you can use your customer interviews for that I was talking about is to just start asking people, just list for me the kinds of things you use the site to publish. Get them to, a lot of times people that have very little technical knowledge of the actual CMS even can tell you, I make these kind of blog posts, or I create landing pages every this kind of a tentpole event or whatnot. Talk to them about the current challenges that they have, but they'll often, tell you about things like, it takes forever for us to make a new product feature page or something like that. But ask them about the kinds of things they're publishing, the frequency of publishing those things, and then the process and workflows behind publishing those things. This can begin getting you at what we call a content model. Now, how many of you are already quite familiar or do content modeling much in your process? Okay, some. So it's a fairly simple, straightforward thing. So a content model aims to capture in various forms the types of content your site, your product needs to publish or include, and the discrete attributes that make up those content types, and then the relationships between them. It's really that simple. And on a Drupal site, you often have the opportunity to look at, what does the existing Drupal site have in terms of content types in there? It's not necessarily, it's going to show you how whatever design got modeled into Drupal, not necessarily your ideal content model, which is why I recommend starting with talking with people about what they need to publish, what they need to do with the site. The content model can take a lot of different forms over the lifecycle of a project. They often, for us, start as very simple diagrams. We live workshop them with our customer groups and client teams and whatnot to try to figure out and sort of iterate together on them. In the end, they often get translated into things like what we call a data dictionary, a spreadsheet that has everything a developer needs for each content type to build the thing out. But in terms of why to start by content modeling, there's a few reasons. They're pretty straightforward. First is every project has a content model. I always say content models are a little bit like a worldview. Everyone has one, but most of the time they're looking through it and not at it. And so people haven't realized how janky their content model can be sometimes because it's just what they've been in. It's what they've been using and doing. Secondly, developers have to build it eventually. So if you don't spend any time creating a content model as a part of a strategy UX design process, developers are going to abstract one out of your designs anyways. It's going to happen, and you may not, how it happens may not make sense, and they may lack a lot of context, which will frustrate them just as much when it doesn't serve a particular editor well or whatnot. So, also, it shapes internal workflows. Your content model sort of winds up shaping the things that end up becoming the ways people hack the site to get it to do what they want it to do. And so, like, significant time spent on avoiding said hacks can be really useful. So content models, I found to be one of the most powerful things in the design process. And the last thing is just that future redesigns will live and die by it. They really rely on a solid content model that works well. If you spend the time and get it right to have a content model underlying your design system that works really well, the next redesign doesn't actually have to rethink all that and can actually make much greater improvements usually. So what's a content model? How do you start making one? At Lullabot, we've sort of honed in on a process of dividing the content model up into 4 distinct kinds of content types that we're looking for. This is like asset content. This is sort of the core information on your site that your site's audience cares about and usually comes to the site for. Micro content, these are supporting elements that enhance that asset content types. Structural are the organizational content types, the tools that sort of simplify navigation to your asset content. And then presentational content types are things that are sometimes ephemeral that support a design need but could go away in a future redesign potentially. Here's sort of a quick sort of visual aid to understand that construct. So you have structural content type. You have assets that are being teased within a structural kind of content type or page. And then you have things that are like presentational content types, maybe a hero kind of a promo that can get stuck onto one of these things that could get redesigned later. You have other things like micro content, like a quote that might live within an article, but that never has a URL of its own necessarily. And like I said, a content model may never really be done. I mean, there's a point at which it's being built, essentially. We're starting to build said content model, and often at that point it is more in that data dictionary form. So it's just good to look at it as a living thing that will continue to evolve through the project lifecycle. Okay, so now how do we work outward from that content model to model the design system itself? The great news is that the content model provides us with foundational building blocks. So you can begin by going through each type within your content model and ask yourself, can an instance of this have a URL of its own? If yes, then it's probably either a bespoke page that's designed to specific content that's on that page, or it's a template. If the answer is no, it might be a micro content type, or you might ask yourself, is this a presentational content type that's existing to serve a particular niche design need, but we should think of it not as something that's going to just live on, like we're always going to have this kind of image and caption thing that, in any site design that we do in the future. And as we evaluate our content model and begin framing what I'll call our display model, we're typically looking for the following kinds of things. So bespoke pages. These are one-off things, like I said, designed to specific content. And these are really important in Drupal projects, I've found, because Drupal exists to not have a lot of custom designed content itself. It's custom designed template. So identify those bespoke pages. Find them. Oftentimes you want to have as few as possible. A lot of sites it's just a home page, or it's just a, some tech companies we work with, it's like a particular like product platform page or something, like a pricing page or something like that. Templates are the reusable things, and you'll usually have a template for most of your asset content types. Sometimes you'll have some overlap. It's like, hey, our article content type and our basic page are going to leverage the same template. Bespoke components, patterns are to bespoke components what templates are to bespoke pages in our nomenclature anyway. So bespoke components, you might have something that's like, there's this custom designed newsletter sign up breaker thing for the site that is like, it's designed for that exact thing in form. Whereas a lot of things are more reusable. It's like, oh, well, this is a form email name form, and it's like, there's lots of different ways it could get used. And then lastly, flows. Like you identify each of the user flows that are a part of the design system, common flows, checkout process, things like this. If you're accustomed to Brad Frost's atomic design construct, this may all feel somewhat familiar but oversimple. For a while, our design team actually used atomic design, and that's kind of how we broke all this stuff down. Well, what we found over time is, especially early in our process, when you get designers and developers sort of gearing up for war, or having semantic arguments over classifications of things that in the end really have no bearing on planning out a good design system. So it really wasn't important whether this thing was a molecule or an organism. What was important was, is this something that's reusable and we're designing it in that way, or is this bespoke thing designed to specific content or something like that? And a great content model behind a sound design system, I like to say, is more like a tangram than a classic puzzle. It provides some limits to the kinds of things that you can create with it, but also a great deal of flexibility in the end. So once you've got a rough idea, that sort of first pass of what you think should be within your design system, it's time to workshop, get all these people together. Usually we do this in like one room, we'll actually at a place. We'll get everybody, often at our clients, but if you're a product team or you're not a client services reality, just plan a time to get everybody together, a day or two, to start working on this. I don't have a time, obviously, to do a whole talk on the workshopping, so I want to share just sort of a few really key things that I found when you're workshopping a design system. So it's important to start by, like I said, getting all the customers together with your team of devs and designers, whoever it is that's creating the design system, and cover these three things: the purpose that your design system will serve, the priorities that exist within that design system, and the process for how you're going to make it happen, and what's the short-term and long-term governance model for it. So those three things. One of the best methods I found for getting the whole team aligned around purpose and priorities is a single workshop exercise that we do. So I'll walk you through it real quick. Here's how you do it. It's really easy. Assuming you've been able to get your team, like all the customers together, give everyone a stack of Post-it notes and a Sharpie. Everyone gets 5 minutes initially to create as many Post-its as they want to that describe problems that they have right now. The airing of grievances is what we call this section of the exercise. They can create, sometimes it takes me forever to make this kind of a page. It can vary a lot depending on the people in the room, but give them 5 minutes, let them make as many Post-its as you want, and then people begin one by one going around the room and sharing what they have. Now, as they're doing that, whoever's facilitating, you're just live putting them up on the wall, and when you hear similar ones, you're starting to live group them. And if it's hard to do that, it takes a little skill. Just talk out loud to them about what I think this is the same thing as this. I feel like these are very similar problems. In the end, you end up with a whole bunch of things on the wall, a whole bunch of problems sort of grouped into areas, and it's time to translate them into goals. And this is as simple as just taking a stab live at trying to re-articulate this problem area we have here as what's a goal for our project, our design system around this? And a good way to identify, like if you've actually come up with a way to state it as a goal, is could we measure or know somehow that we accomplished that? And that's a big thing to get everybody, all the customer group on board, figuring that out. But you work your way through each of those, doing your best to restate each as a goal, and then you can begin prioritizing. And the first two parts of this exercise sort of help get people around that core purpose for this design system project that you're doing. But the prioritizing, there's sort of two ways that I found that can work really well. And those are voting and two-axis sorting. So voting is simple. You'll already have all these Post-its that you've retranslated into goals. Put them all up there. Give everybody 2 or 3 sticky dots, depending on how many people you have in the room, and say, spend them on the goals that you think are most important to this being a successful thing for us. And you can spend it all on one. You can spend them across 2 or 3. You have to kind of look at how many people you have and how many goals or problems to determine, should we give them 2 stickers or 3 stickers, but it's not usually that hard to figure that out. Sometimes you'll do that and you'll end up with not a ton of clarity. A ton of clarity around these 4 things, but they all have similar amounts of votes. That's where 2-axis sorting can be really useful. So it's as simple as create a vertical axis, a horizontal axis. A couple common things that we find really helpful to 2-axis sort with are internal impact versus external impact. And you just do this live. So you'll take a goal and you'll say, here's one of our goals. Tell me where you think this goes. How high, how far to the right? And so internal impact and like positive impact for our internal team here at this organization. External is like impact for our end users, the people who actually come to the site. Those things that wind up high in the right are obviously the ones that are super important. Another one that's awesome, especially if you have limited dev resources in a project like this, is to make sure that you do a positive impact versus level of effort. And having everybody in the room to part of that discussion, because sometimes you'll find that the content teams are saying, no, that's a way higher level of effort, and devs are saying, well, that's trivial to do, and vice versa. So it's a great exercise with your goals to try to figure out what's really important. And that one, obviously, you're looking for those easy wins. What are the things that are really positive impact, but really low level of effort? Maybe we should prioritize those things. Lastly, you can group all the other things too. So your model that you've created of your design system, your bespoke pages, templates, whatnot, get everybody together, take each of those things, assign them primary, secondary, tertiary. We tend to define primary items as things that relate directly to a high priority goal, or things that will have a wider stakeholder or customer group associated with them. And those often, you really need to make those things primary because getting to done on them is always harder when there's just a lot more people involved. When you have clear prioritized goals and a clearly defined starting point for your content and display models that's also prioritized, I feel like your chances for success go up really dramatically. So purpose, priorities, and process was the third one I mentioned for workshopping. Those are the 3 fundamentals. So let's talk about process really quickly. It's really important that the whole team, all the various customers for a design system, have a clear understanding of both how you'll create the system together, like what are the steps, what are the things we're going to make, what are the things we're going to show each other and collect feedback on, and also what's the governance model. Nathan Curtis from 8Shapes wrote a great article on design system governance modeling, and I'll share it at the end here. I don't have time to cover all the details of that right now, but I'll share a little bit from it in a second. You can also just live diagram on a whiteboard when you're workshopping together. Take all the things that you know your team makes. Maybe your team doesn't even do all these things, but figure out what the things your team does in a design creation process. Put them all up there on a whiteboard. And just talk through with each of them what you want to diagram and capture is who are the parties involved for various feedback and approval processes. What's that process going to look like? What's an appropriate timeline for this kind of a team? So it gets at sometimes the big reason we do this in part is to identify things that we don't even need to be creating. What are things that are artifacts but really don't really help anybody, or that don't need to get feedback collected on them? You also want to discuss the end product. What form does the thing need to take? Like I said, sometimes a design system is a combination of documentation and then things that live elsewhere. Sometimes it's like, no, we really need to talk about a single place that this whole thing lives. It's a design system as a product. And making sure that everybody is on the same page about that. Maybe it's a pattern lab integration with a Drupal theme, but you're going to hold documentation is all actually within the CMS itself. So it's all there as helps for users. And lastly, answering that 5th question, the governance modeling question, how will we create and maintain the system well into the future? What's the ideal governance model? So in Nathan Curtis's article, he talks about there's sort of 3 primary types of governance models for design systems. And it depends on your situation. So the first is sometimes referred to as the overlord model. And honestly, I found this is sort of the most common in terms of how a design system starts within a product team or an organization. Somebody says, hey, we need this, and starts creating it and makes it available to people. And over time, they just become this overlord person who it's whatever the needs were that they were serving, they're going to keep doing that. But there's all these other people who maybe want to borrow some things from it, but it doesn't really serve everybody's needs across an organization that well all the time. There's the centralized model in which you create an actual central team that is your design systems team, and that team sort of exists to try to serve all the parts of the organization. So they're going to actually do some work to work with everybody. And then lastly, there's what's called the federated model, which essentially is there's actually constraints and governance rules around the design system itself that empower disparate people throughout the organization to contribute to said design system. This is the hardest to pull off, really, and so I think the order I gave them in is the order of the sort of life cycle I've actually seen for some design systems. When we did some work with IBM, they had basically started as an overlord model, and when we came in, they had actually established a team that was being called the design systems team at IBM. And we were going to try to work with them to actually fix a system that had been mapped backwards from containers and make it mapped outward from content. And what we found was that team was still sort of in an overlord kind of a mode, even though functionally they were called centralized. And so getting them to begin doing a customer research process with all the customers of the design system helped them get to more centralized. Getting to federated is much harder. So anyways, that's a lot, and I want to save 4 or 5 minutes for questions in case there are any. I also should note I'm working on some articles to try to go deeper in some of these areas that I talked about. So if there were parts of this that were interesting to you or you would like to see, please just shoot me my email is just Jared, Jared, at lullabot.com. If you want to email me, ask me questions, or say, hey, could you give me more on this? I'm at jponch on Twitter, if you want to hit me up there. I don't tweet much, but I am available. And if you're looking for more resources or a little more depth on some of these areas, I created a Google Doc, and it's just at bit.ly/designing design systems with hyphens. And so links to Nathan Curtis's article that I mentioned and a couple other things are all in there. So thanks much. I suppose we do have 3 minutes before photo time if there are a question or two anybody has. Otherwise,
just like to know more about going from Pattern Lab to Drupal, like how that process works normally, or is there a standard way to do that?
That's probably a better question for my colleague Mike Herschel. So our design teams worked on projects where I can think of 2 that I've been on where Pattern Lab was in use and a theme integration. I was not the one owning exactly how we implemented that, though. Do you want to?
You can ask me afterwards.
Sure.
Yeah.
Not
a 2-minute.
Why is inconsistency bad?
Why is inconsistency bad?
Yes.
I suppose it depends. In most websites, inconsistency is bad from a user experience standpoint. In other words, there's only so much, it adds what we refer to as cognitive load in user experience design. So you learn a way or you develop an expectation for where you find X or how a certain thing works. Sub-navigation is a great example of this. Jen's worked on a project where we just kept discovering more ways they handled sub-navigation, and it's really confusing to users. So I think, that's one side of it, the user experience side. The other side of it is just from a brand standpoint. I was recently with another big tech company talking with them about their problems, and their problems were they had a product team. There was inconsistency even within their product itself. They had a Marcoms team that did all this other stuff. That wasn't consistent with their product. And then they had this other team that was doing all this event stuff. So they had all these different parts of their site, including the product itself. And visually, it didn't all feel like their brand. It was just wildly inconsistent. And so consistency can help you kind of have a sense of a brand and a product and a quality experience.
How does this work if you're starting from scratch and you don't have a whole website to start with?
So the reason I mentioned at the beginning, if you're working on a smaller, so if you're on a product team, but it's like a startup and the thing doesn't even exist, a lot of times you're not in a design systems mode. However, understanding where that thing could end up is really important. So looking through those principles, constraints, patterns, and documentation and saying, at the outset here, we're just doing this little thing with a home page and a product features page and a pricing page or something like that. Like, you're not thinking of it probably as in depth in terms of modeling out a whole bunch of display patterns and things like that. So you might actually look at it and say, we're not going to really worry so much about the pattern side for right now. Let's establish really great constraints at the outset. So as this thing does begin growing, at what point will we know we're going to move from these one-off pages we've made on a Jekyll site for our product here to, no, we're going to model this thing out and give people more tools. So it probably depends on team size, content creation practices, and things like that. Got time for one more.
Okay, I think it could be quick. In the centralized or federated, was that the process?
The governance modeling?
Yeah, governance model. Is everyone bringing their own content type model? And is there a name or a term for like one that works?
So the one of the things that's important in governance modeling is establishing almost like if you're familiar with like a RACI matrix, now my brain's fried and I'm not going to think of every one of what all those stand for, but responsible, accountable, anybody can help me out here. We do that kind of thing with all the different parts of the design system. So we will look at something like a content model and say, what's the process going to be for additions, changes to our content model over time? And then who's responsible over that? So the governance model, sometimes you end up with two governance models, and there was a project that I was recently working with Jeff Eaton on where this was kind of emerging, where there was sort of a governance model that needed to be established over content and their content model, and then there was a separate governance model that needed to be established for the design system, but the design system is highly dependent on said content model. As new things get added, like, hey, our organization is now doing events, and all of a sudden the CMS team's like, we're adding events to Drupal now, and then the design team's like, well, we got to design those. They become a part of that design system. They have to be accounted for in terms of what are the rules for who gets to change the designs of them and whatnot. So interrelated. Thanks. I think we're supposed to go to the photos now. So thanks a lot.